To him, it was just a deal. To her, it was the beginning of a life she could never have imagined. But what neither of them expected was the way fate would intertwine their hearts. The grand hall of the Blackwood estate echoed with an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the distant hum of the city outside. Isabelle, dressed in her simple maid's uniform, hurriedly polished the marble banister, trying to stay invisible in a house where invisibility was a survival skill. She had worked here for 6 months, cleaning up after people who barely acknowledged her existence, and that was how she preferred it. Until today. Today, everything changed. Damien Blackwood, the billionaire CEO whose name dominated every headline, stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching her. His ice blue eyes were as cold as ever, his sharp features betraying no emotion. He wasn't the kind of man you ignored, but Isabelle had learned to avoid looking at him too long. His presence was overwhelming, suffocating, and frankly, terrifying. Isabelle, his deep voice commanded, startling her so much she nearly dropped the cloth in her hand. She turned, her heart racing. Igrejas, sí. Come to my office. Now. The command sent a shiver down her spine. Had she done something wrong? She couldn't afford to lose this job. Not when she had rent to pay and a brother in college depending on her. Nodding quickly, she followed him, her mind racing with possibilities. Damien's office was as intimidating as the man himself, dark mahogany walls, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the city, and an enormous desk that seemed to symbolize his power. He gestured for her to sit, but Isabelle hesitated, standing nervously at the edge of the room. Sit, he repeated, more firmly this time. She obeyed, clutching her hands tightly in her lap. I need your help, he said, leaning back in his chair, his tone cool and detached. My help? Isabelle echoed, confusion lacing her voice. Yes, I have a problem, and you're the solution, he continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. She blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. Me. Damien exhaled, running a hand through his perfectly styled dark hair. The board is pressuring me to settle down. They think my personal life, or lack thereof, is bad for the company's image. Investors want stability. A family man. It's ridiculous, but appearances matter in my world. Isabelle frowned, still not understanding where this was going. I need a wife, he said bluntly. The words hung in the air, heavy and shocking. Isabelle's jaw dropped. I'm sorry, what? A fake wife, he clarified, as if that made it any less absurd. Someone who will play the role, attend events, smile for the cameras, and keep the board off my back. It's strictly business. And you think I'm the right person for this? She asked, disbelief evident in her tone. You're discreet, unconnected to the media, and trustworthy, he said, his tone matter of fact. I've done my research. You need the money, and I'm willing to compensate you generously. Enough to change your life. The offer was like a slap in the face. She wasn't sure whether to be flattered or insulted. You think I'd marry you for money? Yes, he said without hesitation. Isabelle stared at him, stunned. Mr. Blackwood, I'm just a maid. This doesn't make sense. I don't need someone for my world, Damien replied, his voice cool and measured. I need someone who won't complicate things. Someone who understands boundaries. This arrangement would last a year, and then you'd be free to go, with a substantial amount of money to your name. She stood, her cheeks flushing with anger. This is insane. I can't just pretend to be your wife. It's not right. Damien rose as well, his imposing frame towering over her. Think about it, Isabelle. This isn't just about me. This is a chance for you to secure a future for yourself and your family. I'm offering you a way out. Her breath hitched. He wasn't wrong. The thought of her brother being able to finish school without loans, of finally escaping the endless cycle of barely making ends meet, it was tempting. But could she really do this? Could she marry a man like Damien Blackwood? Even if it was only for show? Take the night to decide, Damien said, sensing her hesitation. But don't take too long. I need an answer by tomorrow. With that, he dismissed her, leaving Isabelle to walk back to her small room with a storm of emotions swirling in her chest. That night, As she stared at the cracked ceiling of her modest quarters, the weight of his offer pressed down on her. It wasn't just about money. It was about stepping into a world she didn't belong to, about pretending to be something she wasn't. But what choice did she have? In the end, it all came down to one question. Was she willing to risk her heart to save her family? She told herself it was just a contract, just a means to an end. But standing face to face with the man who seemed as unyielding as stone, Isabelle wondered if she was stepping into a storm she couldn't survive. Isabelle barely slept that night. Damien Blackwood's offer played on a loop in her mind, tugging at her every doubt and fear. The practicality of the arrangement was clear: money to secure her future, freedom from the endless struggle. But the emotional toll was something she couldn't yet measure. The following morning, Isabelle found herself standing outside Damien's office again. Her palms were sweaty, her nerves stretched thin. She had rehearsed a dozen responses in her head, but none of them seemed right. "Come in," his voice called, calm and collected, as if this were just another business transaction. She stepped inside, her heart hammering against her ribs. Damien was seated behind his desk, his expression unreadable. He gestured for her to sit, but this time she stayed on her feet. "Well," he asked, raising an eyebrow. Isabelle swallowed hard. "I'll do it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Damien didn't look surprised. If anything, there was a flicker of satisfaction in his icy blue eyes. "Good. I'll have my lawyers draw up the paperwork. We'll set a date for the wedding. Something quick and private. There's no need for unnecessary attention." Her stomach churned at his clinical tone. Was this how he handled everything? With cold detachment and zero emotion? "Mr. Blackwood," she began hesitantly, "I have a few conditions." That caught his attention. His brow furrowed slightly as he leaned back in his chair. "Conditions?" "Yes," Isabelle said, her voice firmer now. "If I'm going to do this, I need to know what I'm stepping into. I want clear boundaries, no surprises." Damien nodded, intrigued by her sudden boldness. "Go on." "First," she said, taking a deep breath, "I want assurance that this won't interfere with my family. My brother can't know about this arrangement, and I don't want him dragged into any media scandals." "Done," Damien said without hesitation. "Second," she continued, "I'll play the role you need me to in public, but in private, I want my space. This is a business deal, not a real marriage." His jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. "Agreed." "And finally," Isabelle added, "I need everything in writing. No loopholes, no last-minute changes. I want this to be as professional as possible." Damien's lips curled into the faintest smirk. "You drive a hard bargain for someone who was scrubbing floors yesterday." Her cheeks flushed, but she stood her ground. "I need to protect myself, Mr. Blackwood." "I respect that," he said, his tone softening slightly. "You'll get everything you've asked for. But remember, Isabelle, this is my reputation on the line. If you can't handle the pressure, I expect you to walk away now." "I can handle it," she replied, her voice steady. For the first time, Damien seemed to really look at her not as a maid, but as an equal in this strange, unorthodox partnership. There was something in her eyes that intrigued him, a quiet strength he hadn't noticed before. "Very well," he said, standing and extending his hand. "Welcome to the arrangement." Isabelle hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. His grip was firm, his skin warm against hers, and for a brief second, the weight of what she had agreed to hit her like a tidal wave. The next week passed in a blur of preparations. True to his word, Damien arranged a private ceremony, far from the prying eyes of the media. Isabelle found herself whisked into a world she barely recognized, a whirlwind of designer fittings, etiquette lessons, and endless instructions from Damien's PR team. "Remember," his assistant had told her, "the public will be watching. You need to look natural, like you've been part of his life all along." Easier said than done, Isabelle thought as she stood in front of a mirror, dressed in an elegant white gown that felt like it belonged to someone else. The day of the wedding arrived too quickly. The ceremony was held in Damien's private estate, with only a handful of guests, mostly board members and close associates. Isabelle felt out of place among the crowd, their judgmental eyes scanning her as if she were an artifact they couldn't quite classify. Damien, on the other hand, was the picture of confidence. He stood tall and composed, his every movement calculated. When he took her hand during the vows, Isabel felt a strange mix of comfort and unease. His touch was steady, reassuring even, but his expression remained unreadable. "You may now kiss the bride," the officiant announced, and Isabel's heart skipped a beat. Damien leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a brief, mechanical kiss. It wasn't passionate, but it was enough to sell the act. The guests applauded, and just like that, Isabel Blackwood was born. As they walked down the aisle together, Damien leaned close to her ear, his voice low. "Smile, Isabel. You're Mrs. Blackwood now. Act like it." She forced a smile, but inside she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a deal with the devil. She had thought the hardest part was saying, "I do," but living under the same roof as a man who felt more like a stranger than a husband was a challenge she never anticipated. The car ride back to Damien's estate was suffocating. The silence between them was as vast as the gulf separating their worlds. Isabel sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, while Damien checked emails on his phone, completely unfazed by the fact they had just gotten married. When they arrived, the household staff greeted them with polite congratulations, though their eyes lingered on Isabel, curiosity flickering in their gazes. She felt like an imposter, stepping into a life she didn't belong to, and the grandeur of the estate only amplified her unease. "This is where you'll stay," Damien said, leading her to a suite on the east wing of the mansion. The room was larger than her entire apartment, a luxurious blend of soft cream tones, plush carpets, and a massive four-poster bed that looked like it belonged in a movie. "I'll be in the west wing," he added, his tone businesslike. "We'll maintain separate quarters unless appearances require otherwise." "Understood," Isabel said, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside her. "I've arranged for a stylist to prepare you for tomorrow's charity gala," he continued, as though they were discussing the weather. "It's our first public appearance as a married couple. You'll need to look the part." Before she could respond, Damien turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the opulent room. Isabel exhaled a shaky breath, her gaze sweeping over the unfamiliar space. She had stepped into this arrangement with open eyes, but the reality of it was far more daunting than she'd expected. The next evening, Isabel found herself standing at the top of a grand staircase, dressed in a custom designer gown. Her reflection in the mirror had been almost unrecognizable, glamorous, poised, and far removed from the simple maid she had been just days ago. As she descended the staircase, Damien was waiting for her at the bottom. He was breathtaking in a tailored black tuxedo, his sharp features softened slightly by the faintest smile of approval. "You clean up well," he said, offering his arm. Isabel hesitated before taking it, her cheeks flushing at the compliment. "Thanks, I think." The charity gala was held in a sprawling ballroom filled with the city's elite. The chandeliers sparkled like stars, and the air buzzed with laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. Isabel felt out of place, but Damien's firm grip on her arm kept her grounded. "Remember," he whispered as they stepped into the spotlight, "smile and stay close to me." She nodded, forcing a smile as dozens of eyes turned toward them. "Damien, congratulations on the marriage," a silver-haired man exclaimed, clapping Damien on the back. "And this must be your lovely wife." Isabel extended her hand, offering a polite greeting. "It's nice to meet you." "Charming," the man said, his gaze lingering on her. "Where did you two meet?" Before Isabel could stumble over a response, Damien smoothly interjected, "At a private retreat." It was fate. The lie rolled off his tongue effortlessly, and Isabel found herself marveling at his ability to manipulate the truth. She played along, nodding and smiling as more guests approached with questions and congratulations. By the end of the night, Isabel's cheeks ached from smiling, and her nerves were frayed from pretending to be part of a world she didn't understand. As they finally stepped into the car to head home, she let out a weary sigh. "Tired already?" Damien asked, raising an eyebrow. "It's exhausting pretending to be something I'm not," she admitted. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You'll get used to it." "I hope not," she muttered under her breath, earning the faintest smirk from Damien. The days that followed were a blur of events, interviews, and carefully orchestrated appearances. Isabel quickly realized that being Damien Blackwood's wife wasn't just a title, it was a full-time job. The media scrutiny was relentless, and every move she made was analyzed and critiqued. But it wasn't just the public pressure that wore on her. Living with Damien was an enigma in itself. He was polite but distant, his cold demeanor making it impossible to tell what he was really thinking. Their conversations were brief and transactional, and Isabel often found herself wondering what lay beneath his icy exterior. One evening, as she sat alone in the sprawling library, flipping through a book she wasn't really reading, Damien entered the room. He seemed surprised to see her there, his usual mask of indifference momentarily slipping. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, pouring himself a glass of whiskey from the bar. "No," Isabel admitted. "This place feels overwhelming." He sat in the armchair across from her, studying her intently. "You'll adapt. You're stronger than you think." The unexpected compliment caught her off guard, and for a brief moment, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something vulnerable and human. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual stoic expression. "Why did you agree to this?" she asked suddenly, surprising even herself with the question. Damien leaned back, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Because in my world, reputation is everything, and you, were the perfect choice." His words were practical, devoid of emotion, but Isabel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story than he was letting on. "You could have chosen anyone," she pressed. "Why me?" For the first time, Damien hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost reflective. "Because you reminded me of someone I lost," he admitted, his eyes meeting hers with a vulnerability that made her heart ache. The room fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging between them. Isabel wanted to ask more, to understand the man behind the cold facade, but Damien stood abruptly, his walls snapping back into place. "Good night, Isabelle," he said, his tone back to its usual clipped precision. As he left the room, Isabel sat in the quiet, her mind racing. For the first time, she wondered if this arrangement would cost more than she was prepared to give. Not money or freedom, but her heart. She had thought he was impenetrable, a fortress of cold logic and control. But every now and then, a crack would appear, revealing the man buried beneath the billionaire facade. The days turned into weeks, and Isabel began to settle into her new life, or at least she pretended to. The mansion no longer felt like a prison, but it still didn't feel like home. The staff were polite, but distant, treating her with the same reverence they reserved for Damien. Yet, there were moments when the weight of the arrangement pressed down on her. At night, in the silence of her grand suite, she would think of her old life, of the simplicity and struggle that had been hers alone. Now she was caught in a gilded cage, tethered to a man she barely knew. Damien, for his part, remained an enigma. He was rarely home, consumed by his work, and when he was there, interactions were brief and impersonal. But every now and then, something would slip, a look, a word, a moment of vulnerability that made Isabel question everything she thought she knew about him. One evening, Isabel found herself wandering the mansion's sprawling garden. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. She had always loved sunsets. They reminded her that even the longest days had their end. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Damien approach until he spoke. "Beautiful, isn't it?" She turned, startled to see him standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. His usually sharp features were softened by the fading light, making him look almost approachable. "It is," she replied, her voice quiet. "I didn't think you noticed things like sunsets." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "I notice more than you think." They stood in silence for a moment, the tension between them less palpable than usual. It was one of those rare instances where Damien seemed human. "Why don't you ever talk about her?" Isabel asked suddenly, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. Damien stiffened, his jaw tightening. Whoever it is you lost," she said softly. "You mentioned her once, but you've never said anything else." For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, his expression unreadable. Her name was Evelyn, he said finally, his voice low. She was my fiancée. We were supposed to get married 3 years ago. What happened? Isabelle asked gently. She died in a car accident, he said, his tone clipped, as if forcing the words out was physically painful. It was my fault. I was driving. Isabel's heart clenched at the raw pain in his voice. She wanted to say something, to comfort him, but the walls around him were too high, too fortified. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Damien nodded, his gaze still distant. Don't be. It's not something I talk about, and it's not something I'll talk about again. And just like that, the moment was over. He turned and walked away, leaving Isabelle standing alone in the fading light. The days that followed were quieter, as if Damien's admission had created an invisible thread of understanding between them. Isabelle found herself noticing the subtle ways his grief lingered. The way his gaze would drift to a photo on his desk, the way he avoided certain songs or places. She also began to see glimpses of the man he tried so hard to hide. He wasn't just a cold, calculating billionaire the world saw. He was a man carrying a heavy burden, one that had shaped every part of his life. But those glimpses only deepened Isabelle's confusion. She had agreed to this arrangement with the understanding that it was purely transactional. Yet the more she saw of Damien's humanity, the harder it became to keep her own emotions in check. One night, after a particularly grueling day of public appearances, Isabelle found herself in the library again. She had taken to escaping there when the pressure became too much. She was curled up in an armchair, reading a novel when Damien walked in. He looked tired, his tie loosened and his usual crisp demeanor slightly disheveled. Can't sleep? He asked, echoing the question he had posed weeks ago. Not really, she replied, closing her book. You. He shrugged, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. Sleep doesn't come easy these days. There was something different about him tonight, less guarded, more approachable. Isabelle decided to take a chance. Do you ever regret it? She asked. Regret what? This life. The money, the power, all of it. Damien chuckled, though there was no humor in it. Regret isn't something I can afford. This life is all I've ever known. It's what I've built. But at what cost? She pressed. He looked at her, his blue eyes piercing. At every cost. The honesty in his words took her breath away. For the first time, she felt like she was seeing Damien Blackwood, not the billionaire, but the man. You're not as cold as you pretend to be, she said softly. And you're not as fragile as you think, he replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. They sat in silence after that, the unspoken understanding between them growing stronger. For the first time, Isabelle didn't feel like an outsider in his world. And for the first time, Damien didn't feel as alone. Sometimes the hardest walls to tear down are the ones we build to protect ourselves. But as Damien and Isabelle's lives intertwined, those walls began to crack. The weeks turned into months, and Isabelle's role as Damien's wife became more complex than she'd anticipated. Publicly, they were the picture-perfect couple, attending galas, smiling for the cameras, and sharing carefully crafted moments that fed the media's insatiable curiosity. Privately, however, they were still navigating the fragile balance between their arrangement and the emotions that neither dared to name. Damien remained an enigma, his demeanor shifting between moments of vulnerability and the cold distance he so often used as a shield. Isabelle found herself drawn to him, not because of his wealth or power, but because of the glimpses of the man he tried so hard to hide. One evening, as the first snowfall of the season blanketed the estate, Damien invited Isabelle to join him for dinner. It was a rare occurrence. Most nights, they ate separately, caught up in their own routines. The dining room was warm and intimate, the firelight casting flickering shadows on the walls. Damien had even dismissed the staff for the evening, leaving just the two of them to share the meal. I thought we could use a break from the usual chaos, he said, pouring them both glasses of wine. Isabelle smiled, surprised by the gesture. Thank you. It's nice. As they ate, the conversation flowed more easily than it had in weeks. They talked about everything and nothing, the latest headlines, her favorite books, his travels around the world. For the first time, Isabelle felt like they were just two people, not a billionaire and his contractual wife. You know, she said, twirling her fork in her pasta, for someone who runs a global empire, you're surprisingly good company. Damien smirked. I'll take that as a compliment. It was meant as one, she replied, her smile softening. Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. After dinner, Damien suggested they take a walk in the gardens. The snow had stopped, leaving the grounds glistening under the soft glow of the moon. Isabelle wrapped herself in a thick coat, her breath visible in the crisp air. It's beautiful out here, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It is, Damien agreed, his gaze fixed on her instead of the scenery. As they strolled along the path, their conversation turned more personal. Damien spoke of his childhood, growing up in a world of privilege, but always feeling the pressure to live up to his family's expectations. Isabelle shared stories of her own struggles, from losing her parents at a young age to working multiple jobs just to make ends meet. You've been through so much, Damien said, his tone laced with admiration. And yet here you are. So have you, Isabelle replied, stopping to face him. But you hide it behind this wall you've built. Why? He looked away, his jaw tightening. Because vulnerability is a weakness in my world. If you let people see it, they'll use it against you. But not everyone is out to hurt you, Damien, she said gently. He met her gaze, something shifting in his expression. Maybe not everyone. For the first time, Damien reached for her hand, his touch hesitant but warm. Isabelle's heart raced as their fingers intertwined, the simple gesture carrying a weight she hadn't expected. The following days were different. Damien's walls didn't crumble entirely, but they began to lower, allowing Isabelle to see more of the man behind the cold exterior. He started to share small pieces of himself, his favorite books, his love for classical music, the way he found solace in the quiet moments when the world wasn't watching. Isabelle, in turn, found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't with anyone else. She told him about her dreams, her fears, and the part of her that still struggled to believe she belonged in his world. You belong here more than you think, Damien said one evening, his voice soft but firm. Do I? Isabelle asked, her doubt evident. You do, he replied, his gaze steady. You're stronger than you realize, Isabelle, and you've already changed more than you know. The words lingered in the air, filling the space between them with a warmth that neither could ignore. But as their connection deepened, so did the complications. The media's interest in their relationship only grew, with tabloids speculating about the nature of their marriage. Rumors swirled, some painting Isabelle as a gold digger, others suggesting that Damien had ulterior motives for their union. Isabelle tried to ignore the headlines, but the harsh words cut deep. One particularly cruel article called her the maid who dared to marry a billionaire, mocking her for her humble beginnings. I don't care what they say, Damien told her one night, finding her staring at the offending article. They don't know you. They don't know us. Do we even know us? She asked, her voice trembling. He stepped closer, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. I know enough to know that I don't want to lose you. Isabelle's breath caught at his words. For the first time, Damien wasn't hiding behind his usual stoic mask. He was raw, real, and heartbreakingly human. I don't want to lose you either, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the pretense of their arrangement melted away. They weren't just two people tied together by circumstance. They were two hearts, broken in different ways but finding solace in each other. When the heart begins to speak, even the loudest doubts struggle to drown it out. But love, fragile and new, can be a battlefield of its own. The days after their shared confession were unlike anything Isabelle had imagined. Damien, the man who had once seemed untouchable, was beginning to let her in. It wasn't immediate or easy. He still carried the weight of his past like armor, and she, in turn, wrestled with her own insecurities. But something had shifted between them, and there was no going back. One afternoon, as Isabelle wandered through the grand halls of the mansion, she found herself in Damien's study. The room was as imposing as its owner, dark mahogany shelves lined with books, a sleek desk devoid of clutter, and a massive window overlooking the estate. Looking for something? Damien's voice startled her, and she turned to see him standing in the doorway, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Just curious, she admitted, feeling caught. This room feels so you. He chuckled, stepping inside. And what does that mean? It's intimidating, controlled, and somehow still inviting, she replied with a teasing smile. Damien raised an eyebrow. Inviting? That's a first. She laughed softly, and for a moment, the tension that often lingered between them dissolved. Damien crossed the room and gestured toward one of the bookshelves. These are some of my favorites, he said, pulling out a worn copy of a classic novel. They've been with me through a lot. Isabelle took the book from him, running her fingers over the aged cover. I didn't expect you to be a romantic. I'm full of surprises, he said, his tone lighter than she was used to. Their shared moments became more frequent, and with each one, Isabelle found herself falling deeper. Damien's kindness was subtle, often buried beneath his gruff exterior, but it was there. He began to prioritize dinners at home, conversations that lingered late into the night, and small gestures that made her feel seen. One evening, after another gala filled with forced smiles and endless small talk, Damien walked Isabelle back to her suite. As they stood outside her door, he hesitated. You were incredible tonight, he said, his voice quieter than usual. Isabelle blushed. I'm just following your lead. No, he said firmly, his blue eyes locking onto hers. You were yourself. That's what makes you stand out. Her heart skipped a beat at his words. Before she could respond, he leaned in, brushing a soft kiss against her cheek. It was fleeting, almost tentative, but it sent a warmth through her that she couldn't ignore. Good night, Isabelle, he murmured, stepping back. Good night, she whispered, watching him walk away with her heart pounding in her chest. But even as their bond grew stronger, the outside world refused to leave them in peace. The media's relentless scrutiny intensified, and whispers of Damien's business rivals exploiting his personal life began to circulate. You need to be careful, his lawyer, Michael, warned him one day. This marriage is drawing attention, and not all of it is good. Damien dismissed the concerns with his usual confidence, but deep down, he knew there was truth in Michael's words. His world was ruthless, and Isabelle was vulnerable in ways he wasn't. That realization hit him harder than he expected. For years, Damien had protected himself by keeping people at arm's length. But now Isabelle was in his life, and the thought of her being hurt because of him was unbearable. One night, Damien found Isabelle in the library, her favorite refuge in the sprawling mansion. She was curled up in an armchair, lost in a book when he entered. Busy, he asked, his voice softer than usual. She looked up, smiling at the sight of him. Just passing the time. What about you? I needed to see you, he admitted, taking a seat across from her. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. Is everything okay? He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. I've been thinking about us. About this arrangement. Isabelle's heart sank, fear gripping her. What about it? I didn't expect this to happen, he said, his gaze intense. I didn't expect to care for you the way I do. Her breath hitched. Damien, I know this wasn't supposed to be real, he continued, his voice raw with emotion. But it is, at least for me. Tears welled in Isabelle's eyes as his words sank in. She had been afraid to admit it, even to herself, but hearing him say it made her feel like she wasn't alone in her feelings. It's real for me too, she whispered, her voice trembling. Damien reached for her hand, his grip firm but tender. I don't know how to do this, Isabelle, but I want to try. For us. Her tears spilled over as she nodded, her heart full of emotion she couldn't put into words. In that moment, the walls that had separated them finally crumbled, leaving nothing but the truth between them. But as they began to navigate their newfound relationship, challenges loomed on the horizon. Damien's enemies were watching, and not everyone was willing to let them have their happiness. Love, once found, becomes the greatest strength. But in a world filled with greed and power, even the strongest love faces storms that threaten to tear it apart. The days following Damien and Isabelle's heartfelt confession felt like a dream. Their dynamic had shifted entirely. No longer confined to the boundaries of their contract, they began exploring a genuine relationship, filled with stolen glances, quiet laughter, and moments that felt too perfect to be real. Damien softened in ways Isabelle hadn't thought possible. He made time for her amidst his grueling schedule, showing her sides of him that few ever saw. They shared breakfast together, walked hand in hand through the snowy gardens, and spent evenings curled up by the fire. But as their bond grew stronger, the storm brewing around them refused to settle. It started subtly, an email Damien received from an anonymous source, threatening to expose private details of his marriage to Isabelle. Attached was a photo of them from a private moment in the garden, a look of undeniable love on their faces. "I've handled worse," Damien said when he showed Isabelle the email. His tone was calm, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed his frustration. "Who could do this?" Isabelle asked, her voice trembling. "Someone looking for leverage," Damien replied grimly. "This is how my world works. They'll try to find cracks and exploit them." Isabelle felt a pang of guilt. "I don't want to be a crack in your armor, Damien." He stepped closer, cupping her face in his hands. "You're not. You're my strength." His words gave her comfort, but the unease lingered. The threats escalated. Tabloids published speculative articles about their relationship, fueled by insider tips from unknown sources. Isabelle became a target of public scrutiny, with headlines dissecting her every move. The maid turned mistress. How creative, Isabelle muttered one morning, tossing a magazine onto the table. Damien frowned as he read the headline. "You don't have to read that garbage." "It's hard not to when it's everywhere," she replied, her frustration evident. "I'll handle it," Damien said, his tone firm. But Isabelle wasn't convinced it was that simple. She saw the weight it placed on him, the way his shoulders seemed heavier and his smiles a little less frequent. One evening, Damien called a meeting with his legal team and security advisors. Isabelle sat silently beside him, feeling out of place but determined to stay by his side. "This is no longer about gossip," Michael, his lawyer, said. "Whoever's behind this has resources and connections. They're not just after your reputation, Damien. They want something bigger." "Let them come," Damien said coldly. "They'll regret it." Isabelle admired his confidence, but couldn't shake the fear that crept into her heart. She hated the thought of Damien having to fight yet another battle, especially one that involved her. Later that night, Damien found Isabelle sitting by the window in her suite, staring out at the snow-covered grounds. "You're quiet," he said, taking a seat beside her. "I'm just thinking," she replied softly. "About?" She hesitated before speaking. "I don't want to be the reason you're dragged into this mess, Damien. Maybe if I weren't here." "Don't," he interrupted, his voice sharp. "Don't even think about leaving." Tears filled her eyes as she looked at him. "But what if staying makes things worse?" He reached for her hand, his grip firm. "You're not leaving, Isabelle. Not now. Not ever. We'll face this together, no matter what." His words were a lifeline, grounding her in a moment of chaos. The following days were a whirlwind of damage control. Damien's team worked tirelessly to track the source of the leaks and fortify their defenses. Meanwhile, Damien and Isabelle put on a united front, attending public events and refusing to let the pressure show. At one such event, a charity gala, a reporter cornered Isabelle as she stood alone near the bar. "Mrs. Hart," the reporter began, her voice dripping with faux politeness, "how does it feel to go from maid to billionaire's wife? Surely it's quite the adjustment." Isabelle's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain composed. "It's certainly been an unexpected journey," she replied, her tone measured. "But love doesn't follow a script, does it?" The reporter's smirk faltered, and Isabelle took that as her cue to walk away. When she returned to Damien's side, he placed a protective hand on the small of her back. "You handled that well," he murmured. "I learned from the best," she replied, smiling up at him. But despite their efforts, the pressure continued to mount. Late one night, Damien received a call that changed everything. "They found the source," Michael said, his tone urgent. "Who is it?" Damien demanded. Michael hesitated. "It's someone from inside the company." Damien's blood ran cold. Betrayal from within was the last thing he'd expected. The revelation sent shockwaves through their already fragile world. Damien launched a full-scale investigation, determined to root out the traitor. But as the truth unfolded, it became clear that the threat was more personal than he'd realized. Isabelle could only watch as Damien worked tirelessly, his determination unwavering. She wanted to help, but she knew this was a battle only he could fight. One evening, as he sat in his study, poring over documents, Isabelle entered quietly and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly. He looked up at her, exhaustion etched into his features. "I'm doing this for us, Isabelle. For our future." "And I'm here for you," she replied, her voice steady. Damien reached for her hand, holding it tightly. In that moment, she saw the man behind the cold billionaire facade, the man who was willing to fight for what mattered most. When betrayal comes from within, the battle isn't just about winning. It's about protecting the ones you love. But will love be enough to weather the storm? The investigation into the betrayal consumed Damien's life, but it also brought clarity. He wasn't just fighting for his company or his reputation. He was fighting for Isabelle and the life they were building together. The betrayal came to light sooner than expected. The mole was a high-ranking executive, someone Damien had trusted for years. His name was Philip Grant, and his motivations were as old as time: greed and jealousy. "I always knew you were cold, Damien," Philip sneered during the confrontation in Damien's office. "But watching you fall for your maid? That was the last straw." Damien's jaw clenched, his fury barely contained. "You risked everything for a cheap power grab? You've underestimated me, Philip." Philip's smug expression faltered as Damien called security. "You'll regret this," Philip spat as he was escorted out. But Damien wasn't done. He ensured Philip's actions were reported to the authorities, his connections severed, and his influence eradicated. When Damien returned to Isabelle that evening, the weight of the day hung heavy on him. She met him at the door, her concern evident. "Did you handle it?" she asked. "It's over," he replied, pulling her into his arms. She sighed in relief, resting her head against his chest. "I hate that you had to go through this." "I'd do it 1,000 times if it meant keeping you safe," he said, his voice steady. With the betrayal behind them, Damien and Isabelle finally had room to breathe. They retreated to a secluded cabin in the mountains for a much-needed escape. The cabin was a world away from the grandeur of the mansion, a cozy, rustic retreat surrounded by towering pines and endless snow. For the first time in weeks, they found peace. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Damien surprised Isabelle with a question. "Do you regret marrying me?" She looked at him, her expression soft. "How could I? You've given me a life I never dreamed of. And not because of the money or the mansion, but because of you." His gaze softened, and he reached for her hand. "I never thought I'd say this, Isabelle, but you've changed me. You've made me believe in love again." Tears filled her eyes at his words. "I didn't think I deserved this kind of love," she admitted, "but you've shown me that I do." He leaned in, capturing her lips in a tender kiss that spoke of promises and a future they were both ready to embrace. Their time at the cabin solidified their bond. They spent their days exploring the snowy trails and their nights wrapped in each other's arms. For the first time, Damien let go of the walls he'd built around his heart, allowing Isabelle to see him fully. "I used to think love was a weakness," he confessed one night, "but with you, it feels like my greatest strength." Isabelle smiled, her fingers tracing the lines of his face. "And I used to think love wasn't meant for me, but you've shown me otherwise." When they returned to the city, they were met with new challenges. The media's interest hadn't waned, and Damien's business rivals continued to plot against him. But now they faced everything together. Damien made it clear to the world that Isabelle was more than just his wife. She was his partner, his equal, and the love of his life. At a press conference addressing the recent scandals, Damien stood before a room full of reporters, his voice steady and unwavering. "I married Isabelle because I love her," he said. "She is my strength, my compass, and the reason I fight every day to be better. To anyone who questions her place in my life, know this: she is my heart, and there is no life for me without her." The room fell silent as his words echoed, leaving no room for doubt. Back at home, Isabelle watched the press conference on television, tears streaming down her face. When Damien walked through the door later that evening, she ran to him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice trembling. "Yes, I did," he replied, holding her close. "You deserve to know how much you mean to me." In that moment, all the pain and struggles they had endured felt worth it. Months passed, and their life settled into a new rhythm. Damien's business thrived under his leadership, free from the shadows of betrayal. Isabelle, too, found her footing, embracing her role in Damien's world while staying true to herself. One evening, as they sat in the garden under the stars, Damien pulled out a small box. "I know we're already married," he said, opening it to reveal a stunning diamond ring. "But this is for the life we've built together. Will you continue this journey with me?" Tears filled Isabelle's eyes as she nodded. "Always." As Damien slipped the ring onto her finger, they both knew that their love story, once born out of necessity, had become something neither of them had ever expected. A love that was real, powerful, and unbreakable. Damien and Isabelle's life seemed to have finally settled. The storm that had once threatened their love was now a distant memory. Days turned into weeks, and the mansion that had once felt so cold and empty began to feel like a true home. Isabelle brought warmth and life into every corner of Damien's world, something he hadn't realized he needed until she arrived. Their mornings were quiet and peaceful. Damien would often wake before Isabelle, watching her sleep with a sense of calm he never thought he'd experience. When she finally stirred, her sleepy smile was enough to make the stress of his day ahead feel lighter. One particular morning, Damien surprised Isabelle with breakfast in bed. As she sat up, her eyes lit up at the sight of the tray filled with her favorite treats. Damien had even taken the time to arrange the pancakes into the shape of a heart. She couldn't help but laugh, feeling a deep sense of love for the man who had once seemed so distant and cold. The moment was simple, yet it felt monumental. It was these small, tender gestures that reminded Isabelle of how much they had both grown. Damien was no longer the untouchable billionaire she had feared, and she was no longer the timid maid who felt out of place in his world. Together, they had created a space where they could simply be themselves. As they ate, they talked about the future. Isabelle had always been hesitant to bring up the topic of children, knowing how complicated Damien's past was. But to her surprise, Damien was the one to broach the subject. He looked at her with a soft smile and said he had been thinking a lot about their family. Isabelle's heart skipped a beat as she listened to him share his thoughts. He admitted that while he had once been terrified of the idea of expanding their family, Isabelle had changed his perspective. She had shown him that love wasn't something to fear. Isabelle felt tears welling up in her eyes as Damien reached across the bed to take her hand. He told her that whatever path they chose, he was ready for it as long as she was by his side. It was a moment of pure honesty that made Isabelle feel more connected to him than ever before. The weeks that followed were filled with joy as they began planning the next steps in their life together. Isabelle found herself growing more confident in her role, not only as Damien's wife, but as someone who could bring her own ideas and contributions to the table. Damien encouraged her to pursue her dreams, offering his support every step of the way. With his help, Isabelle started a small charity focused on helping women who, like her, had struggled to find their place in the world. The project became a source of pride for her and a testament to how far she had come. The public, once skeptical of their relationship, began to see the genuine connection between them. Photos of Damien and Isabelle at charity events, laughing together or sharing tender moments, started to circulate. The media that had once scrutinized their every move now described them as a power couple who had defied the odds. But while their public life flourished, it was the quiet moments at home that truly mattered to them. Whether it was sharing a cup of coffee in the morning, working side by side in the study, or simply sitting together in comfortable silence, they cherished every second. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Damien surprised Isabelle with a question that took her breath away. He asked if she would be willing to renew their vows. He explained that while their first marriage had been born out of necessity, this time he wanted to marry her for love. Isabelle felt her heart swell with emotion as she nodded. She couldn't find the words to express how much the gesture meant to her, but the tears streaming down her face said it all. Damien pulled her into his arms, promising her that their second wedding would be a celebration of everything they had overcome together. The days leading up to the vow renewal were filled with excitement. Isabelle wanted to keep the ceremony simple and intimate, reflecting the authenticity of their love. They decided to hold it in the garden, surrounded by the flowers Isabelle had spent so much time nurturing. When the day finally arrived, Isabelle stood in front of a mirror, taking in her reflection. She wore a simple yet elegant dress that Damien had secretly commissioned for her. It wasn't flashy or extravagant, but it made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. As she walked down the aisle, her eyes locked with Damien's. He looked at her with an intensity that made her feel as though they were the only two people in the world. When she reached him, he took her hands in his, and they exchanged vows that were filled with heartfelt promises and the kind of love that only grows stronger with time. The ceremony was everything they had hoped for and more. Surrounded by their closest friends and family, they celebrated not just their love, but the journey that had brought them to this moment. That night, as they danced under the stars, Damien whispered into Isabelle's ear that he had one more surprise for her. He led her to the edge of the garden, where a swing hung from an old oak tree. On the seat of the swing was a tiny box. Isabelle opened it to find a pair of baby shoes. She looked up at Damien, her eyes wide with surprise. He smiled and told her he was ready to take the next step in their journey. Tears filled Isabelle's eyes as she threw her arms around Damien, overwhelmed by the love and happiness she felt. It was a moment that marked not just the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another. Their love story, once filled with uncertainty and challenges, had become a testament to the power of resilience and the beauty of finding love in the most unexpected places. The months after their vow renewal were some of the happiest Damien and Isabelle had ever experienced. They had faced so many challenges together, and now finally, everything seemed to be falling into place. The bond they had forged was unshakable, and they were both more in love than they had ever imagined possible. As the seasons changed, so did their lives. Isabelle's charity continued to grow, helping more women find their voices and their place in the world. She had become an inspiration to many, a living proof that no matter where you started, you could rise to greatness with love and determination. Damien, ever the devoted husband, was by her side every step of the way, supporting her and celebrating her achievements. But it wasn't just their professional lives that flourished. Isabelle felt her heart grow fuller every day, watching their family begin to take shape. The baby shoes Damien had given her on their vow renewal night had been the first sign of the life they were building together. Isabelle had found out she was pregnant soon after, and now, months later, the little one was growing strong and healthy inside her. Damien had been an attentive and loving partner throughout the pregnancy. He was there for every appointment, every moment of uncertainty, and every little kick that reminded them both of the new life they were bringing into the world. He took on extra responsibilities at work to ensure he could be there for Isabelle whenever she needed him, and every night, he would kiss her belly and whisper to their baby, telling them how much he already loved them. One afternoon, as they sat together in the garden, Damien couldn't help but gaze at Isabelle with a sense of wonder. She was glowing, her smile brighter than ever, and her laughter filled the air like music. It was hard to believe how far they had come, from the cold billionaire with walls around his heart to the man sitting beside the woman he loved, eagerly awaiting the arrival of their child. "You're incredible," Damien said, his voice full of admiration. "I never could have imagined a life like this. You've changed everything for me." Isabelle smiled at him, her heart swelling with love. "You've changed me too. I never thought I could be this happy. When I first came into your life, I didn't know where I fit. But now, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." Damien leaned forward and kissed her gently, his hand resting on her growing belly. "This is just the beginning," he whispered. "I promise you, Isabelle, no matter what comes our way, I will always be here. We will always be a team." A few months later, when Isabelle went into labor, it was nothing short of a whirlwind. Damien stayed by her side through every contraction, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement. The delivery room was filled with a sense of anticipation and love, as they both knew that their lives were about to change forever. When their baby was finally born, a beautiful little girl, the world seemed to stand still. Isabelle held their daughter in her arms, tears streaming down her face as she gazed at the tiny miracle they had created together. Damien stood beside her, his own eyes filled with emotion as he looked down at the child they had both longed for. She's perfect, Isabelle whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Damien nodded, his throat tight. She's everything we've ever wanted. They named their daughter Emma, after Isabelle's late mother, who had always been a source of strength and inspiration to her. The name felt right, a tribute to the love and sacrifice that had shaped Isabelle's life and led her to this moment. The first few weeks of Emma's life were a blur of sleepless nights, late night feedings, and tender moments as Damien and Isabelle adjusted to life as parents. Their home was filled with the soft coos of their newborn, and every day brought a new joy, a new discovery, and a new reminder of how blessed they were. Isabelle found herself in awe of how natural Damien was with Emma. She had always known that he had a big heart, but seeing him as a father, caring for their daughter with such tenderness, deepened her love for him in ways she hadn't thought possible. One evening, as they sat in the nursery, Damien gently rocked Emma in his arms while Isabelle sat beside him. The moonlight spilled through the window, casting a soft glow on their little family. I never thought I could feel this much love, Damien said softly, his voice filled with wonder. It's like my heart has grown 10 times its size just from knowing her. Isabelle smiled, her eyes filled with love as she looked at her husband and daughter. I know exactly what you mean, she whispered. I didn't think I could love you more than I already did. But then Emma came into our lives, and now I feel like my heart is overflowing. Damien placed a gentle kiss on her forehead, his hand resting on her own as they sat in the quiet of the night, their daughter nestled in his arms. This is everything, Damien murmured. This is my dream come true. As the years passed, their family continued to grow, and so did their love. Damien and Isabelle navigated the challenges of parenthood with grace, supporting each other through the ups and downs. They watched Emma take her first steps, heard her first words, and celebrated every milestone with joy. Together, they had built a life that was filled with love, laughter, and unwavering support. They had weathered storms, faced betrayals, and conquered every obstacle that had come their way. Through it all, they had remained strong, their love only growing deeper with each passing day. And as they looked to the future, they knew that no matter what it held, they would always have each other. Because in the end, love was not just about grand gestures or sweeping declarations. It was about the quiet moments, the everyday acts of care and kindness, the promises made and kept. Damien had once thought he didn't need love, that it was a weakness. But Isabelle had shown him that love was the greatest strength of all. It had saved him, changed him, and given him a future he never thought possible. Now, as they sat together watching their daughter play in the garden, they knew they had everything they had ever wanted, and nothing would ever come between them again. Years passed, and Damien and Isabelle's life continued to unfold like a beautiful love story, one they had never imagined but were grateful to live every day. Their home, once filled with the quiet echoes of uncertainty, was now alive with the sounds of laughter, love, and the pitter-patter of little feet. Emma, their precious daughter, had grown into a joyful, curious child who seemed to bring light wherever she went. Damien and Isabelle's love had only deepened as they shared countless moments together, both big and small. From anniversaries spent reminiscing about their journey to simple nights cuddled on the couch, their bond had become something irreplaceable. They had learned that love wasn't just about the moments of passion or romance. It was about being there for each other through the quiet moments and the challenges, too. One evening, as the sun set and cast a golden glow over their sprawling garden, Damien and Isabelle found themselves alone in the backyard. Emma had gone to bed, and the house was quiet, save for the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees. It was a peaceful evening, one that felt as though time had slowed down just for them. Damien took Isabelle's hand, leading her toward the bench near the rose garden. They had spent many evenings there, reflecting on the past and looking toward the future. As they sat down, Damien smiled at her, his eyes filled with the same warmth and admiration that had drawn them together all those years ago. You know, Damien began, his voice low and thoughtful, I never thought I would find a love like this. I thought I had everything I needed, money, power, success, but I never realized that the real treasure was right in front of me. Isabelle turned to him, her heart full. She had heard him speak these words before, but they always carried a depth of emotion that made her heart swell. I used to believe the same thing, she said softly. That life was about what we had and what we could achieve. But you showed me that it's not about what we have. It's about the people we love and the moments we create together. Damien squeezed her hand, his thumb gently brushing over her skin. And I'm so thankful I found you, Isabelle. You're everything I ever needed, even when I didn't know it. Tears welled in Isabelle's eyes as she leaned her head against his shoulder. She had never imagined this kind of life, one filled with unconditional love, support, and a family that was hers in every sense. She had once been unsure of her place in the world, but now she knew she had found her home. I'm thankful for you too, she whispered. You've made me feel like I belong. You've given me a family, a purpose, and a love I never thought possible. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last rays of the sun disappear behind the horizon. The stars began to twinkle above them, and for a moment, it felt as though the universe had conspired to bring them together, guiding them on a journey that had led to this very moment. As the evening grew darker, Damien stood up and gently pulled Isabelle to her feet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Isabelle's heart skipped a beat as he opened it to reveal a sparkling bracelet, delicate and beautiful, with a charm in the shape of a heart. I've been thinking about how much we've been through, Damien said, his voice soft and sincere, and how no matter what happens, you and I will always have each other. This is for you, Isabelle, to remind you that you are the heart of everything I do. You are the reason my life has meaning. Isabelle took the bracelet, her hands trembling slightly. Damien, it's beautiful, but I don't need a gift to know how much you love me. You've given me everything, Damien said, his gaze intense. This is just a small symbol of how much you mean to me. I want to spend the rest of my life showing you how much I cherish you. Isabelle's heart swelled with emotion as she clasped the bracelet around her wrist. She leaned in and kissed him softly, feeling the depth of their connection in that simple gesture. As they stood there, holding each other, the world around them seemed to fade away. All that mattered was the love they shared, the life they had built, and the future they were excited to continue creating together. That night, as they lay in bed, Isabelle nestled into Damien's arms, feeling completely at peace. Emma's soft breathing could be heard from down the hall, and everything in their world felt perfect. They had overcome so much together, and now, with their daughter and the love they shared, they knew there was nothing they couldn't face. Isn't it funny? Isabelle murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. How everything we've been through led us here. It feels like fate, doesn't it? Damien kissed the top of her head and pulled her closer. I believe in fate, but I also believe that we made this happen. We fought for each other, for our love, and for our family. And now we get to live the life we've always dreamed of. Isabelle smiled softly, her heart full of gratitude. I couldn't have asked for anything more. And as they drifted off to sleep, wrapped in each other's arms, they knew that their love story was far from over. It was just the beginning of a lifetime of happiness, filled with the promise of forever.